Fire is one of the oldest endings we know. Civilizations rose, expanded, grew complex and layered, and then at some point, many of them burned. That part of history feels familiar. It almost feels expected. But there is something beneath that familiarity that archaeology has quietly been uncovering for decades, something that does not fit as neatly into the standard version of events as most textbooks suggest. When excavators work through the destruction layers of certain ancient cities, they find burn evidence that raises more questions than it answers. Mohenjo-daro, Ugarit. The Mycenaean palace centers, sites separated by thousands of miles and centuries of history, yet carrying similar signatures in the ash. The temperatures recorded in some of these layers, the suddenness implied by what was left behind, the absence of a clear, documented cause. This is not a fringe observation. It comes from the excavation records themselves, from the field reports and stratigraphic analyses that professional archaeologists have published and debated for years. The strangeness is already in the data. It simply rarely gets framed as strange. Historians have reasonable answers for most of this: invasion, climate shift, internal collapse, resource exhaustion. These are serious explanations supported by serious research, and they account for a great deal of what the archaeological record shows. But they do not account for all of it. There are sites where the burn layers appear simultaneously across regions with no documented military connection. There are fortified structures where the stone itself has been fused, transformed into a glassy, vitrified material that requires sustained temperatures. No ordinary ancient fire, no torch timber, no conventional siege has ever been shown to reliably produce. These are not rumors. They are physical facts sitting in the record, largely unaddressed. That gap is what this video is about. Not conspiracy, not mythology, just a part of the evidence that the standard explanation has not yet cleanly resolved. Mohenjo-daro was not a primitive settlement. By the time it reached its peak, around 4,000 years ago, it was one of the most carefully planned urban centers in the ancient world. It had standardized brick sizes, a grid street layout, a drainage system more sophisticated than many cities that came centuries after it, and a population estimated in the tens of thousands. Whatever built this place had accumulated knowledge, organization, and time. And then it ended. When excavators moved through the upper layers of the site, they found skeletons lying in the streets, some still in postures that suggested they had simply collapsed where they stood. There was no mass burial, no evidence of organized retreat. The evidence pointed towards something sudden. The heat signatures found in certain sections of the site have been debated for decades, with some researchers noting temperatures inconsistent with what a conventional urban fire or military raid would typically leave behind. No invading army has ever been clearly identified. No battle record exists. What ended Mohenjo-daro remains, officially, an open question, and the physical evidence has never fully aligned with any single explanation so far offered. Most people think they know Troy, the wooden horse, the 10-Year War, Helen, Achilles. It is one of the most retold stories in Western history, which makes it easy to assume the destruction of Troy is a solved question. It is not. When Heinrich Schliemann excavated the site at Hizarlik in the 19th century, he did not find one Troy. He found many. Layer beneath layer, city built upon the remains of city, spanning thousands of years. And within those layers, multiple distinct burn events, different eras, different fire intensities, different material signatures in the destruction. Homer's war, if it corresponds to any single layer at all, accounts for only one of them. The others have no epic poem attached, no named attacker, no documented siege. They are simply there in the ground, separate destructions separated by centuries, each one raising the same quiet question that the famous version of the story tends to overshadow. Troy did not burn once. It burned repeatedly, and most of those fires have never been explained. Ugarit sat on the Syrian coast as one of the great trading hubs of the Bronze Age world. Ships moved through its harbor carrying copper, tin, grain, and correspondence between empires. It was a city wired into the networks of its time, connected to Egypt, to the Hittites, to Cyprus, to the Aegean. It was not isolated or forgotten. It was central. Sometime around 1185 BC, it stopped existing. What archaeologists found when they excavated the site included clay tablets still sitting in a kiln, letters that had been written but never fired, never sent. One of them was a desperate request for military assistance, addressed to the king of Cyprus. The enemy, whoever they were, had already arrived. The letter never left. The city burned shortly after and was never rebuilt or reoccupied. No confirmed attacker has ever been identified. Ugarit is technically part of the broader Late Bronze Age collapse, but its destruction carries a particular quality of abruptness that even that vast event does not fully absorb. Something came, something ended it, and no one recorded who. Around 1200 BC, something happened that historians still cannot fully explain. Within the span of a single generation, almost every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean either collapsed entirely or suffered damage so severe it never fully recovered. The Mycenaean palace centers in Greece went dark. The Hittite Empire, one of the dominant powers of the ancient world, simply ceased to exist as a functioning state. Canaanite cities along the Levantine coast were destroyed and abandoned. Egypt survived, but only barely, and emerged from the period diminished and transformed. Ugarit, as already noted, vanished without a trace of organized continuity. Scholars have been working on this problem for generations. Eric Klein, one of the most respected voices on the subject, has argued that no single cause is sufficient, and that what the evidence actually shows is a convergence of multiple stresses arriving simultaneously. Drought, earthquake sequences, internal rebellion, the disruption of trade networks, the mysterious group recorded in Egyptian sources as the Sea Peoples. Each of these factors has real supporting evidence. Each one genuinely contributed to the instability of the period. But here is what makes the collapse so difficult to resolve. The destruction layers at sites across this region, sites that had no documented military relationship with each other, appear within the same narrow archaeological window. The burning is not staggered across centuries in a way that suggests slow regional domino effects. It is compressed, and the combined weight of every theory so far proposed still leaves a portion of the evidence sitting without a clean explanation. The scale of what ended in that single generation has never been matched in the ancient world, and the full cause remains, officially, unconfirmed. Scattered across Scotland, France, and parts of Central Europe, there is a category of ancient structure that has never been satisfactorily explained. They are called vitrified forts. From the outside, they can look like any other ruined hill fort, collapsed stone walls, overgrown ramparts, the general decay of something very old. But when you look closely at the stone itself, something is wrong. The rock has been fused, not cracked by heat, not blackened by smoke, but melted and resolidified into a glassy, flowing material, as though the wall was not burned but liquefied. Vitrification in stone requires sustained temperatures of around 1000 to 1200 degrees Celsius. Experimental archaeologists have attempted to reproduce this effect using the materials and methods available to ancient people's timber, thatch, the kind of fire a raiding party might set. The results have consistently fallen short. The temperatures achieved in these experiments do not reliably produce the fused, glassy texture found in the actual structures. Some researchers have suggested the timber lacing within the walls may have contributed to intensifying the heat, but even this explanation has not been demonstrated to fully account for what the stone shows. There are more than 50 of these sites identified across Europe alone. They span different cultures and different centuries. No single military event connects them. No ancient account describes the weapon or method that produced them. The vitrification is simply there, embedded in the walls, measurable and repeatable as a physical fact, and the question of what generated sufficient heat to create it remains genuinely open. When you step back from the individual sites and look at the broader timeline, something uncomfortable begins to take shape. The destruction of Mycenaean Greece, the collapse of the Indus Valley cities, the burning of Canaanite settlements, the abandonment of early urban centers in the Americas. These events do not all share an exact date. Archaeology rarely works with that kind of precision, but they cluster, within certain periods, across regions that had no documented trade relationship, no shared military history, and no known cultural contact. The destruction layers appear within the same archaeological windows. This is not a pattern that requires conspiracy to observe. It is a pattern that emerges from the data when enough sites are placed side by side on a timeline. Researchers who have done this work carefully note the clustering without always agreeing on what caused it. The Mediterranean had its collapse. South Asia had its abandonment phase. Northern Europe has its vitrified walls. The Americas have their own buried burn layers. At some point, coincidence becomes a less satisfying explanation than a cause we have not yet identified. The academic explanations for ancient city destruction are not careless. They are built on decades of fieldwork, careful dating, and genuine scholarly debate. Climate change has strong supporting evidence in pollen records and sediment cores that show prolonged drought conditions aligning with several major collapse periods. Volcanic eruptions have been linked to atmospheric disruptions severe enough to affect harvests across entire regions. Seismic activity is well documented at certain destruction sites. Migrating or displaced peoples putting pressure on existing populations is supported by Egyptian records and regional archaeology. Internal social collapse driven by inequality, resource exhaustion, or administrative failure is a serious and well-argued position. Each of these explanations works within its own context, for its own set of sites, with its own body of supporting evidence. Each one holds up. The difficulty arrives when they are applied collectively to the full picture. Climate does not vivify stone. Earthquakes do not produce simultaneous burn layers across politically unconnected regions separated by open ocean. And no combination of these theories has yet produced a model that accounts cleanly for all of the evidence at once. The gaps are not loud, but they are there. There is a body of scientific research that does not appear in most history documentaries, not because it has been discredited, but because it sits uncomfortably across the boundary between disciplines. It belongs neither cleanly to archaeology nor to astronomy, and that ambiguity has kept it from entering the mainstream conversation with the prominence it may deserve. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that a fragmented comet or meteor system interacted with Earth roughly 12,000 years ago, triggering catastrophic fires, climate disruption, and the collapse of early human populations across multiple continents. The evidence cited includes platinum group element spikes found in sediment layers across dozens of sites worldwide, nanodiamonds that form only under extreme pressure events, and tiny spherules of melted material consistent with a high-energy atmospheric event. This research has been published in peer-reviewed journals and continues to be refined and debated by working scientists. Separately, researchers studying certain ancient destruction layers have noted magnetic anomalies and evidence of intense electromagnetic activity that conventional fire sources do not typically produce. These findings remain contested, but they have not been dismissed outright by everyone who has examined them. Taken together, these alternative hypotheses do not require mythology or invention. They require only that the physical evidence be followed wherever it leads, including toward conclusions that sit outside the current consensus. Behind all of this physical evidence, there are voices. Not scientists or archaeologists, but the people who were actually there, or close enough in time to remember what had happened to the world before them. The Sumerian lament text describes cities reduced to rubble, populations swept away, and a devastation so complete that it felt like the abandonment of the gods themselves. Vedic literature contains detailed accounts of fire falling from the sky, of weapons so powerful they could destroy armies and cities in moments, described with a specificity that has made some researchers uncomfortable. Indigenous oral traditions from the Americas, from Australia, from across the Pacific carry accounts of catastrophic burning, of the sky behaving wrongly, of entire ways of life vanishing within a generation. These texts were long categorized as myth and set aside. But when the physical evidence in the ground begins to align with what the survivors described, the boundary between mythology and memory becomes harder to maintain with confidence. Almost everything discussed in this video exists in the published record. The burned layers, the vitrified walls, the simultaneous destructions, the chemical markers in the sediment, the ancient texts describing fire from above, none of it is hidden in the sense of being locked away or deliberately concealed. It is documented. It has been excavated, measured, published, and in many cases debated openly within academic literature. What has not happened is synthesis. The individual anomalies tend to remain within their own specialist fields, discussed among the researchers closest to them, rarely pulled together into a wider framework that challenges the overall narrative. This is not unique to archaeology or ancient history. It is how large institutions of knowledge tend to work. Consensus builds slowly, protects itself naturally, and resists reorganization even when the evidence at the edges begins to accumulate. A researcher who spends a career studying Bronze Age trade networks is not positioned, professionally or temperamentally, to also integrate cosmic impact data and indigenous oral traditions into a unified theory of ancient catastrophe. The result is not suppression, it is fragmentation, and fragmented evidence, however substantial, rarely achieves the critical mass needed to shift the wider story. That is worth sitting with for a moment. We began with ash. And that is where the honest answer still lives. These cities burned. Some of them burned in ways that the available explanations do not cleanly account for. Some of them burned at the same time as cities on the other side of the world, cities that had no reason to share a fate. The stone in certain walls melted in ways that should not have been possible. The letters were left unsent. The streets were left uncleared. And no one, in the historical record that survived, stepped forward to explain what had happened or to claim responsibility for what was lost. The ground beneath these sites is still being excavated. New layers are still being reached, new chemical signatures still being identified, new questions still being quietly raised by the people doing the careful, slow work of reading what the earth has preserved. What they find in the years ahead may not change anything, or it may change everything. The ash is still there. It has been waiting a long time to be properly understood, and the question of who or what created it remains, for now, unanswered.